They say size isn't everything. Thank you. Don't need to do the next bit. I mean, I'd love to think that was true for personal reasons. But I think our industry has a size problem. We've become obsessed with the small. So, we all love clever little media tactics and clever little stunts. And we're all trying to do more with less. And I think that's really damaging our industry. So in this presentation, Will and I are going to show how small thinking leads to small profits. And we're going to try and tell you how to do something about it, how to break out of the small mindset and make advertising great again. We haven't brought any hats. But first, I want to talk about efficiency. As an industry, we're obsessed with efficiency, and, rightly so. We're spending other people's money, and so we have a duty to spend it wisely. And so I've got some good news from the IPA databank, which is that advertising is becoming more efficient. That trend started a few years ago. So Grace Kite did some good research which showed that ROI, which is the best overall measure of efficiency, so that's the ratio of profit generated to money invested, Grace showed that ROI has been rising for the last few years. And the latest data from the IPA databank shows that since COVID, ROIs have risen by another 4%. So, well done, everyone. You are making advertising more efficient, and that's great. But there is a problem. Advertising is becoming less effective. There are many ways to measure effectiveness, but arguably for commercial businesses, the most important is the amount of profit that you generate. And that same IPA data suggests that the net profit generated by advertising, once you adjust for inflation, is down about 11% since COVID. So, efficiency is up and effectiveness is down. How is that possible? Well, if you're baffled by that, then we need to go back to thinking about the mathematics behind effectiveness and efficiency. Effectiveness is a measure of what you achieve. Efficiency is a measure of, the ratio of effectiveness to effort, or put it this way, effectiveness is efficiency times effort. Financially, profit is ROI times spend. So effectiveness, measured in terms of profit, depends on two things, ROI and spend. Which is more important? Well, to answer that question, what we did was we commissioned, these guys paid for it, it's the royal we there. We commissioned a survey of 500 senior marketers, a representative survey from a wide range of industries, a wide range of firms of different sizes, and we just asked these 500 CMOs to rate the importance of the different factors that drive effectiveness. And this is what they told us. So, according to our CMOs, about 35% of the variations in effectiveness are down to budget. The media plan accounts for about 30%, and the remaining 35% is down to the creative. So, roughly a third, a third, a third. To put it another way, how you spend your money is the most important thing, and it's about twice as important as how much you spend. That implies that they think that ROI is about twice as important as budget. Are they right? To answer that question, we went back to the IPA databank. Now, this is where it gets a little bit technical. So what we did was we looked at variations in effectiveness in terms of the net profit generated, and we used regression analysis to see how big the influence of ROI on effectiveness is and how big the influence of budget is on effectiveness. Controlling for things like category size and inflation, which you have to do to get sensible numbers out. And the answers are quite surprising, I think, to some of you anyway. ROI only counts for about 11% of variations in effectiveness. The other 89% is budget. Look how out of touch marketers are. They think it's all about how you spend your money. In fact, the biggest factor is how much you spend. Budget is 8 times more important than ROI. I was going to say 9, but I got the numbers wrong. My mental arithmetic's not that good, so thank you to the IPA for helping me to do sums. Why is budget so important? Why is it more important than ROI? Well, because budget varies more than ROI does. This is kind of like a guilty secret of the advertising industry. ROIs can vary a lot, but they mostly don't. Most ROIs fall in a fairly narrow range, but budgets can vary enormously from, 0 up to infinity. The variations in budget are much, much bigger, and that gives them more influence. Another thing is that budgets vary in a way that you can control. Most of the variations in ROI are not under your control. There's a lot of chance in there. Now, when we talk about budget variations, those variations have mostly been downwards in recent years. The IPA data suggests that once you adjust for inflation, and again, people don't do that enough, maybe budgets have fallen by about 14% in real terms since COVID. And the data from Gartner, which came out only a few weeks ago, gives us a more detailed picture of what happened. So, when COVID hit, budgets were cut dramatically, and we all know that. As the pandemic receded, budgets bounced back, but they didn't bounce back to their pre-COVID levels, and since then, the trend has been downwards. Now, this chart actually shows the advertising to sales ratios rather than the raw budgets, because that's actually a more important predictor. And according to Gartner, advertising to sales ratios are now 40% below their pre-COVID levels. So it's not surprising that despite those increases in efficiency, we're becoming less effective. So why won't firms invest in advertising? Because, our analysis suggests that the single most important marketing decision that you'll ever make is how much to spend. But our survey shows us that a lot of budget setting is actually quite crude. So what we find is that most firms, most marketers tend to focus on intermediate metrics like awareness or clicks or likes or views rather than hard business measures like sales and profit. That's not going to convince the CFO. Very few of them do any actual financial modeling of the effects of different budget levels. And very few of them test budgets experimentally. Will's going to show us an example of a client that did, but that's quite rare. So if you're not doing financial modeling and you're focusing on these intermediate measures, you're not going to convince skeptical CFOs to part with their money, and so your budgets get cut, and that leads to what I call small thinking. So tight budgets and a focus on efficiency rather than effectiveness, it's a perfect storm. You end up trying to do more with less, and so your targets get tighter, your plans get smaller, everything shrinks. For instance, we've known for decades that really successful brands reach out to all category buyers. But we know from our survey that most firms don't do that. Most firms focus on a subset of the market. They have lower ambitions. In particular, they neglect systematically certain audiences, and this is where I start to, again, my blood pressure goes up, because They neglect older people like me, boring old farts like me, no interest in selling to us, despite the fact that we represent over 50% of consumer spending. We're all about Gen Z, aren't we? Then, having decided to neglect half the market, marketers focus their firepower even further by concentrating on the 5% of that chosen segment who happen to be in market at any given time, and neglecting the other 95%. So, half the market, 5% of half the market, then they match that very tight targeting with a narrow media mix, not using all of the channels, focusing on a few with a particular bias towards digital performance. And actually, that kind of small thinking, as I call it, does increase effectiveness a bit, as we've seen. Sorry, it increases efficiency a bit, as we saw in that earlier chart. But it reduces effectiveness a lot. So, sales and profit fall, budget pressure gets worse, budget cuts get deeper, round and down we go in a sort of death spiral. So, I think we need to think big again. This is my manifesto. Make advertising great again. We need to think in terms of big budgets. We need to think more about big budgets. We need big campaigns. And as Will is about to show us, we need big media. Will.
Thank you, Les.
Okay. Not yet.
That is a hard act to follow, but I've got to try. Extremely compelling, and thank you, Les, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'm Will Davis. I'm co-owner of Media Lab, the media agency, and I founded our data-driven approach to media planning and buying. I'd love to say that we are an overnight success story that's popped up from nowhere. We're not. We really aren't. We have been doing this for 20 years now, and we have some amazing clients. We've been on a journey with all of them, and lots of them want to go big. They don't want to go home. And I'm going to try and bring some of that to life today. So thank you for joining. I'm going to start with a bit on best practice. I think this is really interesting. The idea that we should maximize reach and then build frequency is really well understood in the CMO survey. However, what are people actually doing? Fewer than half of CMOs are actually maximizing their reach. 9 out of 10 don't cap frequency. They're at risk of diminishing returns. And even though all the best practice suggests that we should do more brand than activation, activation dominates brand half of the time. So what can we make of that? Well, it's not about throwing anyone under the bus. Far from it. I think this is a story of pressure. I think this is the pressure that we are all under as marketers. We are constantly trying to prove that marketing is a profit center and not a cost center. And when you're in an environment like that, there is pressure to chase short-term ROI. But does it actually drive your business forward? That's the question. So our business started out in direct response. I can talk from experience. We didn't do any broadcast. We didn't do any brand. We got some amazing CPAs. We're very data-driven. We try and measure the impact of every pound. We're independent. We follow the data. But when clients really want to go big, our experience is you've got to go broader. And actually, we often see charts that look a bit like this. When you bring in a broadcast channel, and you use it for direct response activity, you can find headroom. But guess what? If you use it as a brand channel, you can find even more headroom, but it takes more investment and it takes more time. And that's a really key learning here. And something I find really interesting about our business that we're independent and we're data-driven, ruthlessly data-driven. You might think that we are a business that only does digital activity. We're not. We do a lot of digital activity, but we followed the data and we followed the data into broadcast. We're actually the largest independent UK trader of TV now. I never would have expected that, but it's because it works. And it's exactly what Les talked about earlier. To paraphrase it, effectiveness is efficiency multiplied by scale. So that's our learning. So we think best practice to maximize reach, combine online and offline. On the right-hand side, if you look at media consumption of people aged over 45, we think to get the really big reach, you've got to use some of those offline channels. Even with the younger audience, the 18 to 44s, digital does have more reach, and that's really important, but we still think there's a case to bring in the offline channels. In our view, it's not one or the other. It's about doing both of them and doing them in balance. Now, you can follow the data to where the profit is as well. We do lots of studies. There's brilliant studies in the industry like Profitability 2. And this makes it really clear how important digital channels are because they deliver that short-term return on investment. But actually, in this example, it's the broadcast channel, it's linear TV that's driving the really big profit over a much longer time frame. Now, that's an average. Of course, that's an average across an industry. It's going to be different for every client. And this chart is going to change because what we watch on the big screen in our living room has fundamentally changed. And I expect this chart to change in the months and years ahead. But the challenge is, how do we work out how we can go big with our clients in the most profitable way? And that leads me on to talking about Laithwaites. And this is about going big in practice. Laithwaites is an amazing client and an absolutely amazing business. It was started in 1969 by Tony Laithwaite. His first employee is Barbara, now his wife, and it's still a family-run business with his 3 sons there. They built an amazing business. They love wine. They traveled around France finding the best wine. They bring it back to the UK and they sell it out of the back of their van. This is back in the 70s. It's about as direct response as a business can be. And they build an amazing business over the next several decades. And then we go into lockdown. And lo and behold, Laithwaite sold a lot of wine in lockdown. They could get it to you very quickly, amongst other things. Challenge was when we came out of lockdown, because there's less people in market for wine by mail order. So they have a brilliant direct response team, but no matter how hard they work, sales keep going down and CPAs are going up by as much as 60%. So what do? Well, they did something really brave. They've obviously read Les's work, and they wanted to test the idea of bringing in a broadcast-level brand campaign to complement the activation work. Now, they brought in 2 brilliant marketers to do that, James Morrison, who's here today, and Matt Knight, who've been there and done it, building brands at a broadcast scale, and they wanted to go and test this. How do you go big on a budget? You run an experiment. Now, this was the client's idea. Full credit to the client. The brief to us was, can you make it bulletproof? Because we've got one shot at this. This has to work. We can't afford to run a national campaign. We just can't afford to do that. So we came up with this idea of a regional test. There's 3 things I want to talk about on this. I'd love to talk a lot more about it, but number 1, robust design. This is an Einstein approach to problem solving. If you've got 60 minutes to solve a problem, you spend 55 minutes thinking about it and 5 minutes solving it. What does that mean here? It means we analyzed every data point we could to make sure that this would be a fair test, to make sure that when we did the post-campaign analysis, nothing could wobble it. So we ended up, the whole country got the activation media, but the 2 test regions got the broadcast brand campaign. And we had 2 test regions and 2 controls. 2 tests beats 1. This is all about proving evidence. Because it was an experiment, we went out and aimed at best practice because we could afford to. The optimal balance of brand and activation, the optimal media mix, the ideal reach and frequency. We chose ITV, a brilliant partner for this type of study, perfect audience, their linear TV for our audience, and we used other media channels to build the reach and frequency, broadcast VOD, social and digital. Finally, really importantly, and this is something James really pressed us on, and I think this was a big learning, he knew he didn't have 18 months to prove the payback to the business. The business wanted to know how this was working almost at an hourly level. So James really challenged us on what's going to happen right through the funnel. How many people will see the campaign? How will they start feeling about us? Will they start searching for us? Will they come onto the website? Ultimately, commercial payback, but we plotted out that course. We made sure we invested enough to move the dial, and then we managed the expectations of the business. Now, it's a year to the day that we celebrated that double win. I have to call out Hayden Spicer, Steve Parker, and Sam Clutterbuck, who did so much great work on that. It's not just about getting your media right. If you want to go big, you've got to get the creative right. Laithwaite's got Adam and Eve in. And of course, Adam and Eve produced a brilliant, brilliant ad. I bottled putting the video in case we had a technical failure. But trust me, this is a lovely, lovely film. And you've got this hero character traveling around the world, bringing the wine back to the UK, just as Tony did. Adam and Eve followed best practice as well. They fed it through System 1 until they knew they had a winning asset. Before any money was invested in paid media, they knew they had a winning asset. So A massive thank you to Les and Jay Tom, and also Heather Alderson, who we all worked with together on this project. What about the impact of going big? This is what really matters. Well, we'll start with the brand impact. Brand consideration for Laithwaites. Consideration, as we all know, is quite a tough one to move. In the test regions, brand consideration went up by 80%. Conversely, in the control regions, brand consideration went down by 30%. So we're swimming against the tide, but we're starting to win. And what about the commercial impact? This is the really big one. Incremental revenue went up by almost £3 million in the short term. And over the longer term, that goes up to £6 million. That return on investment is almost fourfold. So that's why I'm a massive believer in going big. This is evidence of that, but it's also evidence that you can do it on a budget. This is a tale of bravery, of balance, but also of measurement, because we went out and proved it. And that first regional test gave the business confidence to do a larger one. And the evidence from that gave them the confidence to go national. It's not just about Laithwaites, it's not just about TV. As Les said, 70% of the CMOs we surveyed currently don't run experiments. I mean, what an opportunity. You could go out and test out of home or radio or more digital channels, but this is a way to go big on a budget, and I'd encourage everyone to give it a try. Thank you. Thank you.
I love that line, bravery, balance, measurement. You know, that's like the SAS slogan that never made it through the research. One of the things I like about that story is, you know, you're a direct response kind of guy originally, and you've got a direct selling client. But when you looked at the data, the answer was big media. So big media is incredibly powerful, but it's not enough. You also need big creativity. Back in 2020, Peter Field, I don't know if you've heard of him, and James Herman did a piece of research where they looked at hundreds of campaigns, and they identified 3 factors that drive long-term effectiveness. The first, as I said in part 1, was budget. The second is the number of media you use. So that fits with what you were saying just now. It fits with Grace Kite's recent research, which shows the more media you use, the bigger the effects. We need, if you like, media diversity. And actually, there was something quite interesting in one of the breakout sessions on that. But the third factor is to do with creative content. As System 1 showed in their recent research, I don't know if Andrew Tyndall is here, but the stuff on long-term consistency, what System 1 have shown is that big effects come from big, long, consistent campaigns, not lots of little ads. And it's only when you have all these 3 factors, big budget, big media, big creative working together, that you get really big long-term effects. So, big campaigns mean big profits. Big campaigns mean big profits. And that's partly because they generate economies of scale. But there is a tension here, because more media means more effects, bigger effects, but more media also means more fixed costs, higher spend on production, more spend on agency fees, MarTech staff, and so on. Now, our survey shows that about 60% of the budget now is eaten up by fixed costs. The latest data from Gartner says 70%. Flip that round, only 30 to 40% of the marketing budget now goes on actually media spend. And that means that media has to work harder to cover your fixed costs. We estimate that now media ROIs have to be of the order of 3 to cover the fixed costs of marketing. And 3 is average for IPA cases, and they're the best of the best. So that suggests probably half of all advertisers are losing money once you take account of fixed costs, which we largely ignore in our ROI calculations. And I'm guilty of this too. Certainly, you know, when we do IPA papers, we tend to shove that under the carpet. So what do we do? This is a bit boring and technical, but I do think it's important. First, When you're optimizing media, you should do that much earlier in the planning process before you make any ads. You should use the optimization calculations to help you decide what ads to make, and you should include fixed costs in those calculations. Now, in my experience, that's very rarely done. And I've talked to other econometricians, and there's a kind of like, oh yeah, we don't normally do that. It's a blind spot. And then, and this is not going to be popular with some of you, we should not make new creative assets unless we can give them the media spend and exposure to ensure they pay back. That's going to mean making fewer ads. Conversely, we should sweat successful ads for longer to get more out of them. So we know that at least for brand ads, wear out is largely a myth. And in fact, there's some evidence for wear in. Sarah Carter and I have talked about this before. And so, as Mark Ritson put it at Cannes, marketers should bake the cake, put it in the oven, and leave it alone. He actually said, leave it the fuck alone, but I'm not swearing. We need fewer, bigger, better creative ideas. But how big is big enough? And here I think we've lost, or many of us have lost our sense of scale. And this, thank you, this also relates to what Tony and Richard were saying in the break about media measurement, because it's become very hard to get a sense of how big is big enough. Let me give you some figures. These may shock you. You make a video ad with decent production values, the kind of thing you'd put on TV. So not a little ad, but a decent ad. You need 1 to 3 million exposures to break even. That's table stakes. That's your bare minimum. One of my catchphrases is, 1 million is a rounding error in marketing. If you want a statistically significant sales uplift in the UK for a decent size, average size brand, you need 30 to 60 million exposures. It's no coincidence that when you see the stuff in a few minutes on influencer marketing, you'll see that they're of that order. It's only those big influencer campaigns that move the dial. And if you want a decent gain in market share, the kind of thing that actually makes real money and wins an effectiveness award, you are talking about 200 to 1 billion exposures in the UK alone. We're not talking about worldwide figures, we're talking about UK figures. Well, can't we just go viral? That's the usual response to this. Well, no, you can't. Viral campaigns fail 96% of the time, according to the IPA data. Other figures put the figure higher. And when viral campaigns, by the way, I'm talking about pure virality. When they do succeed, the effects are small. So let's talk about the biggest viral success of all time. Anyone know what that is? The most watched online video of all time? Sorry? Baby Shark. 16 billion views worldwide since 2016. Now, notice that I said worldwide. This is a little sleight of hand that we often get used to deceive ourselves. 16 billion worldwide, only 1 billion of those in the UK over 8 years. That's quite a lot. Now compare it to John Lewis Christmas advertising. 5 billion views in the UK over 4 years. 5 times as many in half the time. So this is a consistent finding. Viral effects are useful, but they're relatively small. They're small compared to a mid-weight TV campaign. And John Lewis, successful as it was not a massive amount of media spend. And the same is true of influencer marketing. Influencer marketing at its best is like adding ITV3 to the plan. Literally, Ronaldo has about the same reach as ITV3. In the UK. So we need to stop thinking small and start thinking big again. We need to focus less on efficiency and more on effectiveness. We need to remember that effectiveness is largely about scale. And that means we need to get a lot better at budget setting. Pay it more attention. Pay it more measurement, more rigor. Because if you haven't got enough money, everything else is pointless. We need to think big media. We need to make that transition from thinking in terms of small, clever media tactics and to reach and scale and exposure and media spend and many channels. And we need to think big in terms of creative with, I hate to say it, fewer but bigger, better creative ads. And finally, we need to reward and celebrate big campaigns, not little stunts. So go big or go home. Thank you.
Thank you.